at the Catholic University here in Rio de Janeiro, PUC-Rio. She's also a senior fellow with CEBRI, and Gabriel Gama, who is a journalist from Folha de São Paulo, covering environmental and climate issues with a particular interest on climate disinformation strategies and information integrity about climate and climate science and climate policies in particular. So we have accumulated strong evidence about the anthropogenic nature of climate change. We have sufficient evidence about the role of the fossil industry, of agribusiness, and many other industries, facilities, PR firms in the implementation of obstruction strategies in the world, in the US, in the UK, in many other regions of the world. And so what we believe that it's really important is that we have this discussion about what these strategies are, how they evolve along the years with the evidence accumulated by social science production and research in the last 20 years. This volume presents strong evidence about climate obstruction, and I'm going to give the floor immediately to Timmons Roberts, who is going to make the first presentation. We are going to work with 15 minutes for Timmons, then we have other 15 minutes more or less for Jennifer, and then we come to the comments by Andrea and Gabrielle, right? So we have roughly some 40-50 minutes of presentation before opening the floor to the audience, both here, physically present at CEBRI, and online audience that is following us on YouTube. Timmons, you have the floor.
Thank you, Carlos, and bom dia a todo mundo. I'm very happy to be here, and I'm very excited to be doing our first rollout presentation of this book. We've worked for 2 or 3 years now, a team of 4 co-editors, Carlos, Jennifer, who you've already heard about, and then also Christian Downey, who's at Australia National University. I also want to thank CEBRI, Julia, Thais, Gustavo, and I want to thank you, Carlos, for helping organizing this, and to our commentators. It's very generous of you all to serve in this role. We appreciate it. So I'm going to share my screen and talk about this book. I'm going to talk about 10 minutes, and then I'm going to hand it to Jennifer. So we've broken it up a bit, that I'm sort of setting it up, and then she's going to talk about the main findings in the book, and then I'll come back in at the end for 5 minutes or so about solutions, because I know this is Rio Climate Action Week, so we need to talk about climate action and not just inaction. But I'll explain here why we think climate obstruction is so important. Sorry, there's very tricky business of trying to share this properly because it's being grumpy. Okay, does that look good?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. So I'm a professor at Brown. I run something called the Climate and Development Lab. Jennifer's at the University of Miami, and we both are co-directors of the Climate Social Science Network. And here's the cover of our book we'll be talking a lot about. So just to start, I think a lot of people have different theories about why acting on climate change is so hard, and why we have largely failed to do so adequately according to what the science says we need to do. So some people say, well, the science is uncertain, climate change is a hoax, scientists are hysterical, the environmentalists are just hysterical, or they're all in it for the money. Some people say, the technology isn't there, we should wait. Policy is always problematic. Religious beliefs make us devalue this planet because we're thinking about of afterlife, or that the God put the fossil fuels in the ground for us to use. We're selfish by nature. Our economic system requires growth, and it's unstoppable, capitalism. Global governance is corrupt and inept through the UN system. So we could spend our whole time here talking about all those. They're all important, but we have another theory, and this is the one that we think actually is one that can be more readily acted upon, that there's a real opportunity to make a difference. And that is to understand better the obstruction that's gone on for the last 50 years now, against the science, against the policy, and now even against the technology and the solutions to solve climate change. So I'll be talking about our global organization, Climate Social Science Network, but what we did first of all was to come up with a definition of what we meant by climate obstruction. So we have defined this as the intentional actions and efforts to slow or block policies on climate change. So, and the rest is just to say adequate action. So intentional actions and efforts to slow or block policies on climate change, and of course, the implementation of those policies. So in 2020, we started this thing called the Climate Social Science Network. The idea was to create a new sort of scholarly field of inquiry looking at, who's blocking action. So it has a very big name, but our focus is much narrower. That is, we really want to help advance to inform action. So our theory of change is that we're failing to act on climate change because the opposition has been understudied, it's been therefore invisible, and it's been highly effective. And we'll be talking a lot about it. That social scientists, of which we all are, from different disciplines, can provide research capacity that will help policymakers, help litigators, help climate scientists themselves, NGOs, or environmental non-governmental organizations, foundations, and so on, allowing for more strategic efforts. That a lot of this effort to address climate change has been wasted because we thought that good ideas, good policy, and good technology were going to, inevitably lead to action. So just on CSSN, we have a directory of scholars to be sort of a one-stop shop for journalists or investigators. We also have grants and fellowships. We've given out over 108 seed grants. We have annual conferences. We have networking events. We have some training events. And we have a bunch of working groups. So here's our scholar directory. We're now up just over 800 members. We thought it was going to be like 30 or 50 members, and it's grown tremendously. And we've grown by a third just in the last year. So these are the working groups. This is all on our website at cssn.org, but there's ones on accountability, ones on geoengineering, on the media, on the Global South, obstruction in the Global South, agriculture, how to overcome obstruction, ones on, the financial sector, and then the UNFCCC, and so on. So have a look. On our workshops and events, we've had annual conferences, and then last year we did a rollout of our book, Climate Obstruction Across Europe, which is has 11 case studies of European countries and one about the European Union level. And what's remarkable in that whole effort, I was one of the co-editors of that as well with Bob Brule and Miranda Spencer, was that it's remarkable that anything gets done at all. I mean, even in these countries in Europe, which we think of as quite progressive on climate change, in Northern Europe especially. So that was the volume that we released last year. And then here's the one we're releasing this year. Climate Obstruction, a Global Assessment. It has 13 chapters. Jennifer's going to boil down the big findings, but the point to notice here is instead of doing it by country, we're doing it by sector. So we have ones about the oil and gas industry, coal, steel, and railroads and utilities. Agriculture, we have one on the far right, religious organizations on PR and the media. public opinion, the global south that Carlos was especially helpful on, subnational efforts, the UN and the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and then obstructing adaptation. And then there's these two chapters about overcoming or efforts to address the obstruction through legal means and through sort of non-state efforts, and I'll be talking about those later. So Jennifer, are you ready to take over with this one?
Yep, sounds great. So just to add on to how Timmons has explained why we thought this was urgent and necessary, the IPCC was formed in 1988. We've had these major assessments of the state of climate science. And we are becoming increasingly aware that along with the rise of climate science, of course, came the rise of climate obstruction, with evidence suggesting that obstruction has existed at least since 1980, started off, at least the earliest evidence we have, by the American Petroleum Institute in the United States. Scholarly work on climate obstruction doesn't begin until the late 1990s, early 2000s, but by this point, we do have almost 30 years of publications that we could draw on. And we had enough evidence to show that the problem was not limited to oil and gas alone. As Timmons pointed out, we have these other chapters on transportation, coal, animal agriculture, and other various enablers of these sectors. But we also had to put constraints on the book so that we couldn't address, we know, for instance, that development banks play a role, large international banks and finance play a role. But when we looked into the scholarly evidence, it was too thin to justify an entire chapter. So we've also made that clear in sort of the future directions for some of the work. We also encouraged all of our authors, we have over 100 authors contributing to this assessment, to focus on the post-Paris era. So the focus of the book really is quite modern, recent, last decade. But of course, the chapters draw again on all the literature and this time period, again, spanning from about 1980 to the present. We then, in the first chapter, try to boil down what we could see across these 12 really chapters into 10 main takeaways. And our first is that climate change obstruction is not, or climate action obstruction is not really just about denial. We have focused a lot, and especially in the United States, on the denial of the existence of climate change, which is an incredible, I'd say, social phenomenon that was pulled off as part of this entire network of climate obstruction. But it is by no means the only narrative or strategy in town, especially in the post-Paris world. So our chapter 2 authors who are looking at the heart and soul of climate obstruction, the oil and gas sector, they point out that we're really in this net zero era, that we're seeing a lot of the main fossil fuel companies, but also we could see this in the other sectors as well, animal agriculture, this is certainly true, making these net zero claims. Almost all of the large oil and gas companies have committed to some kind of net zero plan or promise by 2035 or 40 or 2050. Here you can see Shell's, ExxonMobil has done this, Chevron. And this is meant to, I guess, position the oil and gas companies as, again, not part of the problem somehow, but part of the solution, that they understand and recognize climate change, and they're going to move forward into this net zero world. Again, that's hard to imagine how they'll pull that off, but it was really great to see this teasing out part of this thread. As already mentioned, big oil is a key player, probably the beating heart of climate obstruction, but one of many industries actually involved in the network of climate obstruction. And chapter 3 pulls apart the coal, utilities, and transportation sectors. And they have a nice table here where you can see examples of the various actors, organizations, coalitions working across these different industries. So you can see here, you have state actors elite individuals, the utility companies in various countries, acting alongside other kinds of even international organizations. And so this is more complicated than we appreciated. If ExxonMobil for some reason went bankrupt tomorrow, climate obstruction would not disappear. And that is a really important sort of feature of this book to emphasize. In chapter 4, which I was part of, we focused in on the animal agriculture industry's role in obstructing climate action. Pretty fresh, a fresh new industry on the scene in terms of our scholarly understanding. And what we understand now is the role of, and especially in the Brazilian context, the role of animal agriculture in controlling and potentially obfuscating certain aspects of climate science and policy. So we've understood more recently the incredible role of food systems in addressing dangerous climate change. And without food systems, we cannot, for instance, obtain the 1.5 degree ambition target of the Paris Agreement. But not all food systems are created equally, and animal-based foods are disproportionately responsible for climate change. Within that profile, beef in particular stands out as disproportionately impactful. And in the Brazilian context, it's so interesting, of course, because 2 of the top 15 meat and dairy companies in the world are based in Brazil, and JBS is the largest by far meat company in the world. Its rise to power and growth is, I think, very worthy of scholarly attention. Incredible journey through industrial capitalism in just really this century. And these companies have to be taken seriously alongside the major oil and gas players, in part also because of these different social choices within climate science. So one thing that's clear is if you use GWP 20, global warming potential 20, instead of GWP 100, which is the common accounting standard in climate science, the role of methane, for instance, is emphasized more than in other accounting structures. So if we want to address warming sort of immediately and rapidly, methane becomes an interesting gas to talk about. And there's all sorts of ways in which these companies in particular really do not want to talk about methane. They want to keep the emphasis and focus on oil and gas systems and on energy in particular. Brazil is also the top exporter of soy, corn, and chicken, and it's the #2 producer of beef globally, responsible for 11% of global animal-based food production greenhouse gas emissions. Only China is larger than Brazil in this respect. And then we, in this chapter, I wanted to draw in these just common narratives to just emphasize the first point of our chapter, which is that it's not just about denial, it's more complicated than that. And the common narratives across animal agriculture globally that we see in climate obstruction is that animal agriculture's contributions to climate change are uncertain or overstated. Again, that's kind of borrowing from the oil and gas playbook. That livestock production is essential or even good for the climate, that climate impacts of animal ag can be addressed through technical fixes, regulating livestock's unnecessary or infeasible, or will lead to global hunger. And then proponents of reduced animal-sourced food consumption or livestock emissions are misguided or extremist, coming back to that sort of original framing that Timmons was talking about as to why we're in this trouble. We also recognize then that it's not just about these industry sectors, but these groups that help enable or shield these groups even from the reputational damages that climate obstruction may cause. Trade associations were established as a key agent of climate obstruction. They're often doing the dirty work of climate obstruction on behalf of these large companies. And famously in the United States, again, that is the American Petroleum Institute, gets climate obstruction sort of off the ground, if you will, in the 1980s. This is a map that was repurposed from the Europe volume for the global assessment of the structure of obstruction. And you can see here that corporations, foundations, individuals form the kind of basis for obstruction, but there are all these other institutional actors in between there and the policy outcomes. And in addition to trade associations, we identified the networks of think tanks globally that are spreading obstruction. And in the case of Brazil, I thought I would just bring up, again, in light of chapter 4, the one I worked on animal agriculture, the Instituto Pensar Agropecuaria. Sorry, I hope I'm saying that right. I think, Carlos, I heard you many times talking about the Institute Liberdade. These are think tanks that help enable the policy vision and the policy research to advance, in this case, the policy agenda of agribusiness. But again, this is not limited by any means to the Brazilian context. I just thought in the case of being at CEBRI that we would talk about it a little bit more. That's great. And then PR firms, another enabling group identified here as advertising agencies. Groups like Edelman in the United States, of course, a global firm, but we see them, I think, sort of sharpen their knives in the US context. DCI, Hawthorne Group. Now a lot of, in some ways, the obstruction playbook can be disseminated and retooled for national context through these globalized PR firms. And we found that really important, interesting, and a future area for, I think, also the solutions-based work that Timmons will talk about. Some governments have taken leading roles in obstructing climate action. This is not unfamiliar to any of us here. Unfortunately, many of us belong to those governments currently. And there was identified throughout the book, but of course in the chapter that Carlos worked on and in other places, the concern with this kind of anti-science, sometimes far right, in many cases post-truth, we would say, where there's this authoritarian projection of, or project to produce ignorance, and Bolsonaro, of course, is specifically called out in the book in a number of occasions, as is now current, again, as of having sent this book to press, President Trump, as we say, oh, the obstruction is not all about denial, but these leaders have brought a resurgence to the idea that climate change is a hoax in major polluting countries. So quite a concern. And then I won't touch on specifics in these, but obstruction occurs within multilateral governance structures. I hope Carlos might speak to that later. That national and local context shape obstruction, particularly in the global south. I've tried to make that point maybe subtly here, but more explicitly. For instance, there's a great study that we cite about Brazilian newspapers, how they tend to focus in climate change on energy systems and not on the role of agriculture, for instance. And that's just a kind of, again, a kind of single look at a phenomenon we see more generally, that if you have a large polluting sector, potentially in Brazil's case, animal agriculture, there tends to be a kind of blind spot there. Obstruction starts at the top or with these large firms and large industries, but does require social acceptance, especially within democracies. And finally, I will hand it back over to Timmons to talk about all of the hopeful ways in which we're addressing obstruction through regulation, litigation, and social movements. Thank you.
Thanks, Jennifer. That was great. So now I get to try to bring it home and then look forward to the discussion, but there's two more bits to talk about, and that is efforts to address obstruction. And we have 2 chapters about that in the book. And I think we could sort of summarize the kinds of solutions that we've identified as including regulation and legislation to restrict false claims and so on. So in this chapter 12 on legal and state efforts, there are regulatory tools aimed at reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but also on information and transparency, targeting greenwashing, I'll talk about a little bit, and then trying to address undue corporate influence over legislature, so limiting lobbying and so on. So that's sort of these fact-checking claims and limiting or prohibiting revolving doors. That is when government personnel move into industry or industry people move right into government positions. There's all kinds of efforts to restrict lobbyists' access to key staff and legislators. Not always easy. These campaigns of influence are ever evolving and quite sophisticated ways to influence policy. So it's not just sort of traditional sense of lobbyist, somebody having a planned visit to a legislator in their office. I mean, there's everything from, talking to them at their dinner club, their golf course, their, whatever other places that influence happens, churches, schools. There's climate losses I'm going to talk about in a second, and then naming and shaming. So I'll get back to these, and disassociation. So on regulations and legislation, one of my favorite ones that I think is quite important is this EU Green Directive, which was to provide guidance on what can be considered misleading advertisements. So some of the things that were banned were practices related to early obsolescence, saying that something is going to be durable when it's not, the use of generic statements like eco-friendly or ecological or biodegradable on products. So this was very exciting to me that the EU was starting to crack down on these claims by advertisers that really were not backed up by actual changes in the products, making claims about sustainable performance. And that's the basis of some of the agricultural, greenwashing stuff that Jennifer was talking about. However, in June, the EU Commission killed the EU's anti-greenwashing rules. And I'm not sure exactly where this stands right now. I've not found anything more recent, but after pressure from right-wing lawmakers through one of the parties in the EU Parliament, they just kind of froze it and said, we're not going to enforce these right now. So a really helpful initiative that I think deserves to be copied around the world was really put on ice. Very frustrating. On climate lawsuits, there's a lot of them out there so far. So here's a map from our book. And we have this, again, this chapter by Grace Nosek, Joanna Setzer, and Benjamin Franklin Franta, showing where these lawsuits are happening most frequently. Of course, there's a ton in the United States, and but there's a lot in Australia and Brazil. And Brazil has become sort of a hotspot as well. There's different kinds of these reports. Some of them are, at the state level, some are municipal, some are against, they're addressing historical deception by fossil fuel producers, some of them. Some of them address ongoing deception of consumers. So this is sort of consumer fraud is being claimed. They told us that their product was safe and that it was going to make life better. And in fact, it's had known hazards that they hid from us, and they lied to us. Litigation addressing corporate policies, international court and human rights-based actions. And then there's been these sort of climate investigations and hearings, most notably in the Philippines Commission on Human Rights and Climate Change, U.S. congressional investigations on misinformation by the carbon majors, the European Parliament hearings on climate change denial, and then I would include in that some of the ones in Brazil as well, like this. Here's the lawsuit by the Instituto de Estudos Amazônicos at the Conselho Nacional de Justiça. So there's much more. This is a lot to talk about there. I want to finish with some of the sort of fact-checking claims, and especially, this is my last real slide here. Brazil is leading with UNESCO, the UN cultural heritage group, an agency, and the UNFCCC, and 6 countries, Chile, Denmark, France, Morocco, and the UK, and Sweden, are launching this call to action for concrete solutions to address disinformation and related tactics, seeking to delay and derail climate action. I hope there's somebody in the room at CEBRI who knows more about where this stands right now, but right now they're calling for the global mutirão, or sort of a call to action for all of us to describe the work that we're doing, so that the UN can sort of cheerlead and lift up initiatives around the world about efforts to protect the information, because there's so many lies, falsehoods, spectacularized, sensationalized claims about the solutions, and so on. So I'll hopefully we can talk more about this global initiative. It's quite exciting to me. So I am going to hand it back to Carlos, who might add some more, and look forward to the discussion. And thank you all very much.
Great introduction and summary of this very encompassing and huge volume after almost 3 years of work. I'm very excited to see the reactions of our friends here. And on the information integrity about climate science and climate policies, as you know, the Brazilian presidency of COP30 has put it very high on the agenda. It's going to be the first ever COP that is going to have information integrity about climate science and policies high on the agenda. And I think that this is really important. We have around the table colleagues, for example, from FALA, who may want to react on that. I'm sure that we are going to have some contributions from the floor. But now I'm going to hand over immediately to Andrea Hoffman and then Gabriel Gama, who are going to make some comments before we open to your reactions first, after their comments, and to the greater audience for questions and answers. Andrea.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation to be in here and having the opportunity to read the book and have access to this information, which I was following already before. I believe I had a lot of work done, but still the book as a whole is an amazing work. I want to start saying that it is an amazing work in terms of the empirics and the scope, the amount of scholars involved. So this is really serious research, and I hope that bringing that to the public discussion will contribute not only, again, for us as academics and scholars to discuss it, but to have some change on the ground. So, since I have 10 minutes and I believe we'll be discussing a lot of issues after, I have 3 points to make to bring it to the table. First of all, I think I was completely convinced about your main argument that that's not basically only about denial. I've been working also on this topic, and I was calling it's not only about denial, it's about politics, but you have obviously a very kind of clear concept and a lot of empirics to support it. So on that ground, I think it's really an amazing work to combine a lot of data that's there with this clear argument. So I only have 3, I separated 3 points to put on the table now. And one is about, of course, we are here in Brazil, so I thought it would be important to talk about this particularity, that we are here, and you emphasize some elements in the Brazil, but also you have a whole chapter and you discuss it in the introduction about the global north, global south. So one first topic that I wanted to ask you really is about these differences, because on one hand, of course, each country has also a different political system, a different also, climate action and so on. But perhaps we could say that we live in times that very blurred in terms of countries being north, south. There's a whole claim about emerging countries. So what's to be north and south in economic terms today? There's a whole claim about leadership and multilateralism. So again, what's about global north and south? Then another difference that usually interlinked with that is about democracies, autocracies. I mean, previously we had a lot of, I think, in comparative politics, the idea that you could only compare advanced democracies or non-democracies. Again, maybe this is very blurred today. Some countries, and I believe exactly the US and Brazil, it seems that it changed the whole game. I mean, from every 4 years, we thought in Brazil it was a unique thing, point out of the curve, but as more we know about other countries in the world, perhaps we can say that's a global tendency too, that we have a blurred, I mean, democracy is not being very clear, defined, or not really defined, but elements from democracies being eroded from within. There's a lot of literature about that. So you cannot really classify if a country is a democracy or not very easily as previously. And definitely in Latin America and Brazil, we used to think, okay, either we are democracy or we are a dictatorship, a military dictatorship. So after we democratize, we tend to think, okay, it's a little bit better or worse, a lot of indicators, but still democracies. And of course, we had that experience with the previous governments. We can definitely say it was elected, but very clear also say that it was not democratic policies being done. So again, democracies, autocracies, global north, global south, a lot of blurred and volatile, perhaps, elements that are structural. And normally we think about those to think about action to face the obstruction. So the point I wanted to bring is that can we really separate countries in those terms, and what are the differences? Because on economic terms, one of the big elements, at least in Latin America and Brazil, is exactly that we are inserted in the global economy from the periphery, or we have a lot of also literature about that, about the role of primary products and exactly agriculture, and a lot of products that can be included here in the so-called obstructionist actors. So primary minerals or oil and gas. And this, I think, perhaps I'm making the point of as a question, to what extent, I mean, this difference is still the case, a very relevant one, that some countries from the South, when they are facing obstruction, and I think in Brazil that's a very serious discussion taking place, maybe it's not only about lobbies from the private sector, let's say, but also because some of those products, they are key in their economic development. And this is not new, obviously, but my question is in terms of how to face that. And if this is really a clear distinction between being from the global north or south, but not only being north or south historically, but if the sector of those oil and gas and agribusiness, the representation of that sector in the economic development, because we know that these are some discussions that even democratic countries, they put on the table. So it is, in fact, in the end, about finance. It's about some principles, the CBDRs or finance, really then lobby from the private sector. So I want to bring that to discussion because we saw that a lot with the expectation that there will be a lot of change from the previous governments to this one didn't take place. Now we know that the Congress, so to speak, has a certain amount of influence that didn't change. So again, how this can be incorporated in the action to face those obstructionist actors, and therefore how is this linked to democracy? Because I know I have also a chapter only about the far right, but again, maybe it's more than the far right. I want to make this claim here, maybe that even the way the Congress works, even in a more stable democracy, how this Congress is, deliberation is working. You mentioned also the European Union and the Parliament. We know that there is elections. The last elections to the European Parliament is majorly, it moved to the right, and actually the Green Party is moved even more to the bottom. So is this democratic or not? What's the limit of majorities to influence the green, so to speak, policies and affect those actors? Because some obstructionist actors might be more democratic than others. They might be using the legal system better than others. So again, in terms of how to face that, how can those instruments be distinguished? Instruments, you mentioned also in the chapters, and I referred here to litigation. Some obstructionist actors are using litigation democratically, perhaps, but so how can we make this kind of distinction? Again, not only democracy, not democracy, but more subtle, like how, which elements from this use of all these instruments are hurting democracy and which are not, in terms of the constitutions of the countries and all these other access to elements of the judicial and legislative system. Then a second point is about intentionality. And again, I was completely convinced about the intentionality. I have a lot of evidence, strategies, and so on on the side of those actors. But I also wanted to call attention to one element, because that derives also from a previous research that I did on the Latin American region organizations, and some of them that were created based on free trade, and how difficult it has been, even in times that we had at the governmental level or via also civil society and other elements, the call to include climate change elements, and how difficult that has been. Just to give the example of Mercosur, how difficult, because you have an organization created to liberalize trade. So the point is that, do you see that in any in any of these examples, not only countries, but other like regional organizations, because they are the case of the EU, for instance, you mentioned, but in some other cases, NAFTA, previously in the case of the US, this bias through free trade, and I'm not saying that's bad, trade liberalization, I'm just saying that there is a bias intrinsic to them. So this is not perhaps to deny that there is a lot of intentionality between all the, by all those actors, but can't we see also some path dependencies of these, the ways, some elements of some mechanisms of climate action have been included that are not really being very effective, and how to distinguish that, because then in the strategies to face obstruction, we can also face institutional obstruction, so to speak, not actors, but elements in those institutions that are very heavy, and you don't manage to change very obviously, unless you have a very strong counter movement. And related to that, then I have two last points. One, in this counter movement, so to speak, the role of epistemic communities, because in the area of climate change, we have the IPCC, and of course, I was also studying that in Latin America, and how in the sub-regional level, it's also important to have these epistemic communities. I believe you are an epistemic community in terms of the engagement of scientific also arguments, but also advocacy arguments, and a plural, interdisciplinary and worldwide. So how can we foster these epistemic communities in other levels of policy, not only at the IPCC level, but sub-regional levels or multilateral ad hoc levels, not only the UN. And the last point then is when you point to future research. I was looking at the topics you mentioned, and I was curious about the labor unions, because that's the kind of actor that in the past, at least, were very important, very significant, their actions. And well, we follow the transitions and the capitalist transitions and so on. But I have really this question: do you see any evidence or kind of any hope that that these actors, because there's a lot of companies involved, and it's not only governments, and how do you see this the inclusion or the involvement of labor unions in these movements in other countries? So I stop here. I believe we have a lot of so just give some start points to the table. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Andrea. Well, we have already lots of food for thought, right, Timmons and Jennifer? I'm going to hand it over to Gabriel so that he can also make comments.
All right. Thanks a lot. It's an honor to be here. Thank you, especially Carlos, for the invitation. And I congratulate the book as well. It's really thorough work, and I think it does leave a lot of space to debates about this topic, especially in Brazil. In this year of COP30, that this debate of climate is much more enhanced. I would like to begin by saying that to talk about climate obstruction in Brazil regarding journalism, that is my area, we first have to take a step back and talk about climate change as a whole. There are many surveys that say that Brazilians are worried about climate change, but a significant share of people only see the risks in the future. So talking about obstruction, from my point of view, does give this sense of urgency that it's happening now and that things are being obstructed now. It's not a matter of future, it's a matter of present. And I think journalism has two possibilities of entering in this field of obstruction and helping to spread discussions about it. The first one, obviously, is to investigate and to show how this is happening nationally and internationally. I think journalists have this ability, and it is always a challenge to report on obstruction because it's hard to find out what's really happening, but it's always a possibility. And I think most importantly, the second thing the journalists can do is to provide context of this. Because when we have denialists or obstructionists in special positions of power or political level of greater relevance, journalism will report on quotes that are obstructionists or denialists. This is a matter of our profession. And I think that obstruction and denialism as a whole, I think it's great to show this, that obstruction is not only about denial. I think it's a really important thing to be addressed. But obstruction kind of shakes the foundations of journalism because journalists are trained to work on the facts that we see. There is a great metaphor that may help to understand this. Like people are in a room, like we are here, with the windows shut, and they are all asking, how's the weather? Is the weather sunny? Is the weather cloudy? Or is it snowy? And they all ask journalists, how's the weather, journalist? And the journalist's function is to open the window and let people see it for themselves. But the very problem with obstruction, to me, it seems that opening the window is not enough. We have to explain, to give context. So kind of the window will be opened. I think we do have to report eventually on obstructionist quotes from politicals for people that are in greater relevance to our society, because people have the right to understand what they are saying, to know what is being said. But that cannot be done without context. We need to give context to those informations, to those quotes, and to bring that context on the greatest equivalence of the quote said. I think this is the challenge that remains in journalism, to give this balance of what is being said and to contextualize what's behind it and to, qualify this context. I think this remains a greater challenge. I think giving it a name, climate obstruction, helps it a lot because we have been hearing about denialism for a long time, and this has also been kind of distorted in various levels. And I think giving this other deepened understanding of it as an obstruction, I think we have even better words in Portuguese to describe it rather than obstruction, but it is already a beginning to understand this. I think it helps a lot because we can only fight against something we can name. So I think this understanding that there is a playbook, a structured review, as you have made, I think it's of greater relevance. And talking about global initiative that Timmons talked a bit, I have interviewed a few weeks ago the COP30 Special Envoy for Information Integrity, and he told me a bit about obstruction. So I think it is a concept that has entered this space of the COP30 discussions about integrity information, and I think we can expect more. We can follow that closely following months to see how that's going to unfold in COP30. Regarding the introduction of the book, I think I want to highlight when you say that understanding obstruction is one of the key forms, the key ways to fight against it. And I think that's exactly where journalism comes in. to try to explain this context and to, make a discussion of it and to make people understand what it's about. And just to finish, propose discussion, I think perhaps in Brazil, one of the greatest obstructionist discourse that remains is whether fossil fuels can finance energy transition. I think this is central, perhaps, in nowadays discussion, and science does have an answer to this, but I think that it remains a challenge in politics and multiple levels of our society of whether to continue exploring fossil fuels and the finance of energy transition. So I finish by now, and then we can keep on talking.
Thanks a lot, Gabriel. Thanks again, Andrea. As you could understand, they both had access to the book, to the chapter. So don't worry, everybody's going to have access to the book and to all the chapters and all the data, because this book is going to be available very soon online, free of charge. You will be able to download it, right? No payment associated with the download. So this is the part of the policy and the strategy of CSSN to make this really available to every reader across the regions, because we know that this is important, particularly for developing countries in the global south. I have some comments myself, but I'm not going to go ahead. I'm going to hand it over to you, and then I can complement your comments, reacting to Andreas and to Gabriel. I have two pieces, but I'll hand it over to Timmons and Jennifer before I jump in again. Please, go ahead.
This doesn't seem fair, Carlos, but because we got to talk already. But I want to say thank you, Andrea and Gabriel. Those are amazing comments. And Andrea, I have to say, I'm so excited by the comments you just gave that we have to recruit you to the Climate Social Science Network, because to me, you've really laid out two exciting social science approaches. I think in some ways, we are not asking the kind of questions that we're still describing. And you asked us two or three really interesting analytical questions, and I want to just point to them. And that is, I studied world systems theory and dependency theory, and you pointed out the importance of Brazil's insertion in the global economy and other countries, dependence on extraction of oil, gas, and agribusiness, and so on. And I absolutely agree. That's critical to the whole social structure of a nation and its governmental governance structures and so on. And so we need to do some theorizing that I'm very excited to do, and I would love to work with you on this, theorizing how those sort of economic structures drive different types of obstruction profiles in different nations. Carlos, I know you're going to be excited about that too. Just guess. I think that's a really exciting agenda, including for our Global South group. But as you said, the importance is not South and North, but there's other elements as well. And I think your points about democracy were really poignant. And as you said, that we have some very obstructionist actors who are very effective in democratic societies. We have now a new working group in CSSN on authoritarian countries and how their obstruction is different in those countries. So that might be an interesting group to talk about that with. But I think your point is that we can't just be looking there. We really need to be looking at how democratic structures are being mobilized or abused, in our opinion, right, to stop climate action. Just quickly, one last point is to say, I loved your, really, we have to theorize, like what explains the advance or the slowing of obstruction? Again, we're still doing descriptive work. We haven't gotten really to the theorization. And that's why I'm so excited about your commentary. What explains that? What changed? we need a whole theory of why obstruction is bad in certain places or times and situations and sectors. We don't have that theory. We have, again, the figure that Jennifer was using a lot was developed by Robert Bruhl, our co-founder of this organization, and really the thought leader behind starting this whole new field. But it's not really analytical. It's still quite descriptive. Gabrielle, just two confirmations of the points you say that you brought up on the can fossil fuels fund the energy transition? I know the Lula administration used that argument to defend expanding oil production to the mouth of the Amazon and the whole new field of offshore drilling. And to me, it's quite worrisome that it's really locking Brazil in, of course, to decades more of oil. And there would have to be very strong, a sort of irreversible mechanisms to collect royalties or other income from this oil to have it automatically spent on renewable energy and the shutdown of other parts of the oil or petrol, fossil fuel dependency in Brazil. I don't know. That's new territory. Nobody's ever done that effectively. The second would be just to say on the global initiative, I'm very excited about that on climate information integrity. And just to quote Bob Bruhl again one more time, its focus on disinformation, we want to make sure that that includes obstruction more broadly and not just disinformation. Because as Bob says, disinformation is about 10 or 20% of the problem of climate obstruction. It's a very important part that can be addressed maybe more directly through, a focus on disinformation, on fact checking and so on in journalism. But we need to look much more broadly at these structural conditions that I think Andrea really beautifully laid out. I'll shut up. Jennifer.
Yeah, thank you for your comments. I'll make them very brief too. I think Carlos has a lot more insights than I do, and especially into some of the questions you raised, Andreas. But I do want to say that we don't have strong predictive power, not as an organization, not as editors, and not within the scholarship about obstruction. But we have some guiding principles that I think are illuminating. But your point that I liked your words volatile and blurred, I feel are very taken in the 21st century. So even if you look at the network of climate obstruction that Bob Bruhl produced, there are things about that network that are already out of date. So one of the nodes, I don't know if you saw closely, was conservative media. That is clearly not the case anymore. It's very hard even to determine what is conservative media. With accuracy, at least in the US context, we would just have to have sort of the media node, right? So these ways in which all of these things are shifting and blurring, I think is the right word. And then there are questions, I think, even among non-state actors about that we should raise about why did BP, for instance, admit to the existence of man-made climate change before any of the other oil majors? Why we don't have strong predictive power or good explanations for why that occurred, and how that then shifts the landscape, the social landscape for the other oil majors, for instance, which happened again in the early 2000s. And then in the I will say that the Brazilian context for me personally, especially in the study of animal ag, has given so much insight into the kind of preconditions, at least for obstruction. So again, you might not need a lot of flagrant obstruction in a society where it's governed by a monarchy and it's a petrostate. You might not get huge amounts of climate denial or contrarians in television and performance the way we had in the United States. But then hearing about the Brazilian context where you would keep the focus if you had a large sector that was contributing to climate change, but then could maybe hide under the kind of bigger coattails of the oil and gas industry by keeping the focus on energy systems, by talking a lot about oil and gas, by not talking then about deforestation, soy, beef. That seems like, oh, right, of course. And we can use that to then the Brazilian model or the Brazilian example to predict maybe what will be happening in Indonesia with palm oil and deforestation, and Indonesia rapidly rising as a major global emitter. And so I have appreciated this volume and effort for giving us not necessarily, like you say, strong analytic and predictive power, but some kind of guideposts, I think, for where to look and how to move the field forward, and maybe where to predict where we'll see strong obstruction in the future and need to, think about how to deploy some of those solution strategies in advance of those efforts. And we didn't get to talk enough. I really appreciate Gabrielle about journalism and the role of public opinion and public understanding in obstruction. So I look forward to someone else here addressing those concerns.
Thanks a lot, Jennifer Timmons. I'll just say very briefly two things, one to Gabrielle and one to Andrea, before actually handing over to the audience here. And I don't know if we have questions on the YouTubes, so that I could have some access. Perhaps Thais could help me later. I think that Gabrielle has a point. I mean, the energy sector is key, particularly the role of Petrobras here in Brazil. Of course, it's at the heart of our development. It's at the heart of our nationalism. It's the heart of our pride, so to say, of being Brazilian. I mean, Petrobras, oil is ours. I mean, it dates back to the 50s. It has a long trajectory in steering the sense of belonging to Brazil, being a Brazilian, defending oil. Oil is ours, Petrobras is ours. So, of course, with all that narrative, it does play a key role, but I would say that, and very much in agreement with what Jennifer has just said, that the agribusiness, given our national emissions profile, because I think that this is a key contextualizing factor for us to understand how climate obstruction deploys its strategies and modalities, we have to look at the national emissions profiles. And our profile is very much associated to agriculture, land use, and deforestation, accounting for more than 70% of our emissions, which is enormous in comparison to all other rising economies and industrialized countries, right? So I think that because agro is pop here in Brazil, right? Because agro is very much, present all over the country's mindset, Congress, political power, social acceptance, as we have one of the key findings, one of the key takeaways. Of course, I think that it has made it. It is kind of invisible as a climate obstruction agent that is very important, of paramount importance in the Brazilian case, perhaps even more than the energy sector, I would dare say. So just to complement and to react a little bit on Gabrielle's point. On Andreas, great. Andrea and I are going to prepare a course for next term in 2027. So count on us, Timmons. We are going to invite you for some seminars. So we are going to continue this discussion. But I think that, yes, Andrea, the world is blurred. And it's particularly blurred because we have a key assumption in our volume, that the climate emergency is a fact and that we have to act. And so, of course, this is it's not a bias, it's a kind of a philosophical and a practical assumption that there is a strong need to act now, not in 10 years or in 100 years' time, because of the multiple effects of our not acting now that this could have in the near future and in the further future, right? So I think that because of this, it was important for us to also look at the research that exists all over the world. And the research that exists on climate obstruction all over the world is mainly focused on English-speaking countries, particularly the US, the UK, Australia, some European countries. And we have almost nothing or very little research on countries in the developing areas, in the rising economies. And because of their importance in terms of growing importance in terms of emissions, we thought it was important also to have a focus, which is not the case of the volume, but we have some parts, sections within the chapters. We have one whole chapter only focusing on the Global South, because we also wanted, as an epistemic community, as you said, to steer more research about Brazil, Indonesia, South Africa, for example. And when you say about unions, for example, we have to look at the trajectory of development and the political economies of these countries. When you look at South Africa, for example, the labor unions, they are very much connected with the mining sector. Mining is just like in South Africa, like Petrobras here in Brazil, like agribusiness here in Brazil, right? Mining is part of the state formation of South Africa. And so the labor unions, they don't want to lose their jobs, right? They want to secure jobs. And because of the development trajectory of that country is intimately connected with mining and coal. So of course, I mean, transitioning away from these sectors penalizes much more these labor unions that are associated with the core economic sector of that country. But again, our assumption is that irrespective of being right or left, north or south, capital or labor, I mean, we need to act now because anthropogenic climate change is a reality. And it's for the whole planet. So there is a planetary systemic assumption that makes the world even more blurred than what you were describing. And I think that this is very revealing of the need that we have, for example, at least in Latin America, to question the role of the developmentalist paradigm in promoting development models all across the borders of Latin American countries. But I'll stop here. We'll have a seminar. Timmons is invited, right? Jennifer will be invited, and we are going to continue this scholarly debate. But I want now to hand over to the audience. And Thais, please let me know if we have questions from the audience, which is online. So any questions from here? Arthur, please. And then Kalyani. Just
So first, thanks for the presentation. Like, I'm eager to read the book. Like, I'm a student at EST. Milan is my advisor, and we are just like going to publish an article about climate obstruction here in Brazil too. But I have some 3 points to talk. Like the first one, when you presented the solutions, the possible solutions to fight climate obstruction, I missed like. What do you think about the need of structural transformations in politics and economy? Like, is it possible to conciliate capitalism and actions to fight climate obstruction? Like, is it possible just like this, some cosmetic measures like fact-checking and etc.? Like, how about changing development models or changing the way we do politics? I know it's a big question, but like, I want to know your perspective on this about journalism. Like, what's your view as a journalist of the way the journalism is financed? For example, like many of the financiers, like are the big oil, the agro, they pay ads, and how is your vision of it? Like, is it possible to fight climate obstruction when they finance your journalists? That's it.
Thanks, Arthur. Kalyani, please introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Kalyani. I come from London, actually, United Kingdom, and I'm originally from India. So I can see the close BRICS nations, because I'm originally from India, holding UK nationality. I work within ESG and carbon offset space. I'm a functional ESG expert, environmental social governance and carbon offsets. My book was released only 2 days ago here in the Rio Climate Action Week on Article 6 of Guide for the Parliamentarians. And this was one of the topics about, the finance and, this is in the topics I discussed very much. And I'm looking forward to reading that book, and I'm happy to share the link with you all about my book. So my question to you is, coming from a global south originally, but living in a global north, and the question is related to the global north and global south. I would just like to know power asymmetry and fairness. That's a theme. I mean, like many obstructions tactics originate in global north through lobbying, trade pressure, or finance flows. How can global south governments push back without risking economic retaliation? That's number one, because that's the main obstruction I see. Because you want to push something, then you have a big retaliation coming up and say, no, we don't see that as an important point for them. Number two, should climate obstruction by high emitting countries? We all know that US was a high emitting country once upon a time, but maybe not now, but like in the changing circumstances. So should climate obstruction by high emitting countries be formally recognized as a barrier to achieving NDCs under the Paris Agreement, and how does the global south looks into that? I've got a few more questions, but these two are important for the work I'm doing, right? Thank you so much, everyone. Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Kaliani.
Yeah.
Well, I'll hand it over to Timmons and Jennifer if you want to react on the questions, and then I'll hand it over to Gabriel because he had a question addressed to him too.
Jennifer, you go first.
You want me to go first on whether or not climate obstruction has any hope in the face of capitalism? Yeah. I appreciate that you raised the point. It's a valid criticism and or valid issue, of course. There are different theories out there. I mean, you can even just look at whether or not, the energy transition is possible within capitalism. We did not probably spend enough time on the issue of capitalism in the book. Probably some of our authors wished we had spent more, but the empirical evidence is where we kept trying to turn back to say, well, okay, what kind of evidence is here? We were just passing a paper around, Timmons, about lobbying over carbon capture and storage in the United States. When you start seeing the numbers and the frequency of activity, I mean, it's just very clear. Even some of these assignments, Andrea, to your point of, do we live in a democracy in the United States? It's very questionable when you just see the amount of activity. My own view is anti-dystopian, and so I continue to work on climate obstruction under the belief that with the majority of people wanting action on climate change, with the genuine threats that climate change brings, I think it will bring all sorts of new imaginative thinking about systems, economies, new ways of rebuilding the world, which is, to me, what is required. Another scholar, though, would say, I'm sure that some of these things are completely compatible with authoritarian regimes, with capitalism, with basic economic principles. And so I don't want to, let my views reign supreme. And also, these views are not highly represented, I'd say, in our volume in general.
Yeah, I would just confirm what Jennifer just said. We did not spend enough time on whether climate obstruction can be addressed. I mean, I think we saw our first job was to even just document it well. And given the difficulty of accomplishing real structural change in society, we saw the most likely impact of work of social scientists. At least the path we chose was one to hope to increase understanding and consciousness, really, about this whole set of actors and the problem that's so poorly understood. And as you say, that, I mean, it leaves really open the larger question of, is it possible? We don't know. And certainly the problem with capitalism's need for economic growth is highly problematic in climate terms and environmental terms generally. That's a big debate on whether, technology can be mobilized to make capitalism more sustainable. This is the kind of thing we debate in my classes for the last 35 years. And the reason we debate it is because I don't have the answer, but so I get to pose it to my students. And I don't want to take this lightly because I think you're asking the right question. But I will say that there are many types of capitalism, and there's many, even historically in the same countries, but even across the world. There was one other question from the second person, and I'm sorry, your nameplates were so small we can't read them from up here in the sky. Thank you. About whether the global South countries can push back against the global North obstructionism. And I think that's very difficult and super important. And I think that will be shaped, as Andrea said, a lot by countries' insertion in the global economy. If you're highly reliant on, exports to the United States, for example, with Trump in office, he will threaten tariffs against your country if you do anything that he doesn't like. And that's very difficult. Whatever, it'll take a very brave nation, a brave country to take action then, or not. Who knows what drives the crazy decisions of this American administration right now. I think there are clever leaders out there, and I'm thinking of Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum in dealing with this mad king we have here in this country, and managing to avoid heavy tariffs while maintaining some sovereignty. And that's kind of the problem that all of us face in the United States right now, just to be very sober about this, is trying to navigate this this political moment. But I hate this I don't want this to sound wrong, but as social scientists of climate obstruction, we are learning a lot right now. A lot of the hidden mechanisms are being revealed on how the influence is made. We're seeing what these actors wanted. We're seeing how they sought to achieve it, and as they are achieving this rollback of climate action in the United States, at least, and pressure on, as Gabriel said, the international system. Anyway, it's for social science, it's a very important and very instructive moment.
Jennifer and Timmons. Gabriel, do you want to react?
Yes, of course. First, thank you for your question. I think it's always a great debate. First of all, I think every journalist's dream is to be financed by the public, by the readers. This is the goal that most almost all newspapers seek. But especially in Brazil, and I think worldwide, the public discussion about financing and implying perhaps an obligatory contribution to journalism and to journals and to information as a whole is far from an agreement. I think we are very behind reaching any possibility of having a systemic way to finance journalism publicly. And until we reach that point, I think we have we need to find other ways to finance our job, and advertisements and finance from companies is a way. I think it does raise this concern. I think you are right about this. But from my perspective, it does not limit or restrain coverage about multiple topics. I think having advertisements and other contributions, they are one source of finance. They're not the only resource, and does not, from my perspective, limit coverage or talking about the endpoint. But it does, we have to move forward. And I think it's important to mobilize and talk about how people interact with journalism, how they finance, they support journalism as a whole. It's always a challenge. And talking a little bit about all the other topics, I think deforestation and the agribusiness sector in Brazil is, of course, a fundamental sector that needs to be addressed and it needs to be studied closely, especially because there are nowadays many specialists and even the government saying that going to zero deforestation is not enough. We need to move even beyond that. We need to restore what has already been deforested, and it does involve restoring cattle fields and other places that have already been transformed to agricultural activity. And it is, of course, a barrier. We have multiple forms to get there, but as it's such a big field in Brazil, with so many companies, we have so many as well different approaches. Some parts are more are welcoming more some actions, and others perhaps not. So it is a very diverse ecosystem in my perspective, and it does require a greater attention to it.
Thanks, Gabriel. We have one question from the online audience, Jennifer and Timmons. It's from Maggie Rodriguez from Unicamp. She says, good morning. I'd like to hear a bit about the notions of disinformation, obstruction, and climate denial. Could you quickly give perspectives on how you differentiate these concepts and how you see them related? So, disinformation, obstruction, and denial.
Jennifer, you want to give a first swing and I'll come in?
Sure. Well, so disinformation and denial are both forms of obstruction. Obstruction is your broadest category there, where obstruction can encapsulate both the influence on public understanding and discourse, as well as the lobbying efforts and the political actions. And then within public understanding and discourse, you would have all sorts of a variety of tactics and methods, and the disinformation. Disinformation can play a role, of course, in the politics as well, but it's more common to see it deployed in terms of public understanding, and similarly with denial. There's crossover between all of these things, but one thing that I think is really important to understand is some of the work that Timmons has been part of, that they've published, the Lamb paper on discourses of delay, is to again sort of minimize denial as a kind of serious epistemic issue, and to instead focus on all these other ways in which we are experiencing, like, the shifting of responsibility from oil and gas, let's say, to individual responsibility, which is also a legal tactic. But the denial of the existence of climate change, which is what really sets off global climate obstruction, is, to me, in light of all the other forms of obstruction that have happened with other industries, you have the tobacco industry, or you have asbestos before that, of other forms of obstruction. It is uniquely performative, uniquely flagrant among the forms of obstruction. So the outright denial of the existence of climate change, and other people would categorize other things as also denial, like you could deny that fossil fuels contribute to climate change, for instance. But this is not what the oil and gas companies decide to do. They decide to say climate change itself does not exist. That is their first epistemic treatment of this new science that is evolving. And to me, that is just so unique to this particular situation, to the problem of climate change. It's so different from the things that come before it. it's so much an ownership and takeover of both the science, but also our own understandings, imaginations, our vision of what's possible, that I find it really, really sort of incredible.
Yeah, I don't have much to add, just to say, you know, obstruction is the largest category. Denial is both sort of a mental state and a set of tactics and discourses. And then disinformation is, you know, knowingly false, you know, information being advanced. And that's not the same as misinformation, which is sort of people passing along bad information without understanding that they are doing so, or perhaps without knowing.
Thanks,
So,
Jennifer.
good question.
Thanks, Simmons. We are almost there. We have 1 minute. So in my very quick concluding remarks, I want to thank, first of all, Jennifer and Timmons and Christian, who's not here, but he is with us because he's one of our key 4 co-editors, right, over there in Australia. And I'd like to thank a lot Andrea and Gabrielle for being here with us, all the audience, online audience too. And I think that just recalling that this is an assessment, right? And we called it an assessment because we wanted to be based on empirical evidence, because we wanted to be based on the scholarly research, existing scholarly research that we were assessing, right? We wanted to mirror the assessments of the IPCC, right? And this mirroring effect is important to us because, as you know, the IPCC has made huge efforts to build this tremendous consensus around the anthropogenic nature of climate change. But it is highly embedded in the work of natural sciences, exact sciences. And this is the time when social scientists gather together, I mean, from different disciplines, different regions, different perspectives, to produce an assessment of the opposition against climate action and actually even climate science, so that our other fellow scientists from the IPCC understand the role of politics in the implementation of policies, that it's not a linear relationship between the actual production of knowledge being available and then policies change. Well, I think that it's absolutely clear after our debate that the situation is far from being like that. And also I think that our umbrella concept, climate obstruction, it navigates between 2 categories and 2 epistemological categories that are very important in social sciences that we understand a lot, but perhaps other natural and exact scientists do not manage these categories, which are agency and structure. And we are always navigating, and I think that our debates have navigated around how these operators act and how they deploy their strategies, what kind of modalities vary across contexts, etc. But that they're also dealing with some structural, systemic barriers that are part of this discussion, right? And I think this is extremely important for other volumes to come and other research pieces to come, right, Jennifer and Timmons, in analytical terms. And I think that this is a great contribution that we social scientists are giving to the debate. And it's very timely because COP30 is just, I mean, in 73. Thanks, Gabrielle, the journalist. 73 days ahead of us. So it's timely and it's important. Thanks a lot for your participation. Bye-bye.